This episode of EMS One-Stop is brought to you by Lexipol, the experts in policy, training, wellness support and grants assistance for first responders and government leaders. To learn more, visit lexipol.com. That's Lexipol.com. Hello and welcome back to another edition of EMS One-Stop. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence, and we're getting this year off to a roll now. Obviously, the discussion with the folk of New Orleans. We had an amazing discussion about the weather with the chief meteorologist, Sonny Westbrook, last week. We're continuing with some amazing guests, and many of you will remember the Elijah McClain case, the political storm that it caused, obviously the legal case that we all followed closely, and recently at the Pennsylvania EMS Symposium, Law Symposium, our good friend of the show, Doug Wolfberg, brought two lawyers to speak who represented some of the firefighters in that particular case. They gave in 1 hour an absolute masterclass in why we should pay attention to this, the lessons identified, the takeaways for wider EMS. And I'd like to welcome them here today as my guests. So I'd like to bring in Shana Beggan and Mike Pellow from over there in Denver. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. It's good to be here.
So I heard you speak, first of all, of course, at the Doug Wolfberg and the symposium in Pennsylvania. I thought it was a masterclass in what we need to do. And you clearly have some very real lessons and to-dos to pass on to the rest of the EMS and fire EMS world, without a doubt, I think.
I'd agree with you there. I think that well spent. Shana and I have become quite dedicated and interested in the message that we have that I think is important for people to hear, especially people who are first responders.
For us, it's become sort of a passion. First responders are people who run towards difficulties and trauma when many run away. And to see some bodies be charged in this situation and the fallout from it in all the different avenues, and to look forward and try to prevent anybody from being in a situation ever again has become a very strong passion for myself and for Mike, both personally and professionally.
So let's get straight into it then. And obviously many folk certainly have now name recognition with this particular case, but why don't you do a number of things for us? One, give us the background and the history of the case, and then obviously how you became involved. And if you want to start actually with a spoiler alert, where are we today? So that kind of potted resume, if you don't mind, first of all.
I guess I could start at the finish. Shana and I represent Jeremy Cooper. He was a paramedic working for the Aurora Fire Department and has a stellar career. This case involves a young man completely innocent in this and deserves to be alive today. It is a tragedy that Elijah McClain is not alive today. Jeremy Cooper and his Lieutenant Pete Chikuniak responded to a setting where police were holding Mr. McClain. They got a call of a medical emergency, didn't really know what the nature of that was, but arrived at a scene that was chaotic, to say the least, and then were expected to intervene, provide Mr. McClain with medical attention and services. And we're going to discuss that at length during the course of this today. But in a nutshell, there was a tragic outcome whereby Mr. McClain passed away. Our client, as well as Lieutenant Chikuniak, were criminally charged. Our client was convicted of criminally negligent homicide. The case is on appeal right now with the Colorado Court of Appeals, and we continue to represent Mr. Cooper at this very moment.
Given the fact this is an ongoing case, first of all, thank you for coming to talk to us, and obviously thank you for the session that you delivered. And I think we need to hear what you have to say. And so you kind of hinted at the fact we've got a sort of a menu of things to talk about here. And so, those challenges faced by your clients and by EMS providers generally when they approach situations like this, I think you are able to highlight those for us and to us.
I think that some of the big ones that our clients faced are something first responders face every day. Police and fire, and when fire and EMS are separate, all have their unique jobs to do. They have to work together but their roles and their responsibilities are different. And so a huge problem in our case was the communication breakdown, the failure to have any sort of handoff policy. Even though it was a call for a medical assist, there was a extremely abnormal number of police presence, a very active scene with police actively, multiple police and their command staff actively restraining the patient. And in the course of, in our situation, fire medic Cooper trying to gather more information, ongoing and continuing aggressive restraint with additional force against the patient that was seeming to be aggravated by the fire medic's attempt to intervene. That was a major issue. A major issue also was the lack of handoff information, incomplete and inaccurate information. An unique situation for us was, while fire responded and according to their protocols assessed the situation and determined this at the time to be what was at the time referred to as excited delirium, given the information they were provided, they didn't carry the requisite medication for the treatment. So they had this delay during which they were waiting for the medication to get there. And optics played a huge role in that. While the fire medic stayed close, never left his patient's side, was watching, was thinking, on camera, it looked like they were standing around doing nothing. And when you couple that with a terrible outcome, that really was a huge hurdle. Also, this was one of, if not the only, protocol for adults that required a weight-based medication. There was absolutely no real training on how to assess weight, what to do. The gurneys didn't have scales. And so you're dealing with a very chaotic scene in the dark, in the field, multiple people on top of this patient, and you're guessing. You're using your best guess. And the training really underscored to the paramedics that this was very safe. You have individuals that wanted only to help, and they lost their patient eventually. But those, I think, were the major hurdles. Am I missing any, Mike?
Well, there are other things I think we will discuss at more length in follow-up questions, Rob, but I think that's basically it in a nutshell.
So already, for folk that are listening, there are so many yeses, but look, a lot's happened since then. I mean, we've, as a result of excited delirium, we've had discussions about how we address it, what we call it. We've had now joint statements about that from, International Association of Chiefs of Police, National Association of EMS Physicians, and others about this. So, this has been a catalyst for a lot of people to think about changing this. And obviously, we're a few years ahead now, and so quite rightly so. But on the day, I mean, and it's the classic EMS thing about documentation, right? If it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. And that clearly is perhaps an issue. But one of the things that you flagged, of course, is there is documentation issues here and lessons, again, we can take away.
So that's absolutely right. With respect to documentation, one thing they tell lawyers all the time, which we're keenly aware of, is if it's not written down, it didn't happen. And that is an approach that police, fire, EMS, as when they're separated from fire, all should be very cognizant of. One of the things we advocate, and we'll talk about some more, is the use of body cams. Police now have access to body cameras, which help them document things much better than used to happen in the past. That's good for the police. That's good for the people they come in contact with. It's basically a win-win situation. And we'll discuss also some limitations, costs, things like that. But by and large, paramedic fire is best served, and their patients are best served as well, by complete documentation of what happened. As Shana said, Lots of what's on body cams in our trial was the paramedics standing and waiting for the necessary medication to arrive by a separate ambulance. They didn't carry it because of limitations on the system that were in effect at the time. It wasn't their decision not to bring it. It was just a limitation. And so what you can see is what a paramedic does, what he does with his hands, what he does with his person, but you can't tell what's going on in that person's mind. And one of the things we really emphasize at the symposium, I would emphasize today, is document what was going on in your head. Make sure people know it. I was thinking this. This is what I was doing. Account for your reactions and your actions and maybe your failure to act in any particular way. I think it's important. What happened in our case is one person had the responsibility or actually did write the report, and not everybody had a chance to weigh in on that and get everything documented in there. That's important. Whoever writes the report should put where they got the information, when, how, and document to the extent possible. Obviously, that's a lot to do when you're a paramedic and you're busy getting from one call to the next. And I can see paramedics thinking, how in the world could I do this? Which is why we so strongly advocate body cameras used by paramedics to help them document. Police are currently in the practice of, they'll write a statement and they will say, this is a summary of what I did. It doesn't detail everything. For it, all the details, please refer to the body camera, which is a very good practice in our opinion.
I think that with documentation, what I would stress is what you knew, when you knew it, how you knew it. And I would really, really stress, in an ideal world, while paramedic teams and fire teams work as teams, if you have somebody who is designated that is the patient medical provider, in an ideal world, I would want them writing the report. They're the ones making the ultimate patient medical decision making. So in an ideal world, there's going to be exceptions, but that person should write it, and they should write their thought processes, their working field diagnosis, and why. In our case, you heard Fire Medic Cooper tell the other paramedics that showed up with the treatment while they were waiting for the medication to take effect, here's what we're dealing with and why. To us, that was critical because it showed what he was thinking. But that was against a backdrop of all this time that looked like nothing was going on. Also, I have such tremendous respect for who at the time was Lieutenant Pete Chikuniak, later was promoted to captain. He is a leader of all leaders in terms of he leads his team, and he was trying to help, and he's writing this report, but he's filling it in, as is often the case, after the call. So we don't know, when did he actually get to see and truly assess the patient? If we slow it down and can really make it tighter, what do I know? When did I learn it? How does it apply here? And if somebody else is going to write it, make sure it gets circled around so everybody can adjust or add in what they knew. Because as we all found out, there was a 4-man crew, and all 4 had different information and different jobs. And all 4's positions did not make it into that report. Would that have changed anything? I don't know, but I do know when you get called upon to answer for your call, if you don't have a camera and you're called upon a day later, a month later, a year later, 4 years later to answer for it, you're in a very disadvantaged position if all you have is that quick report that we've all seen for years, because they've got the next call they've got to get ready to go to. So we've got to allow, an administrative command staff needs to allow these teams to have the time to write reports that will help their patients and help them to recall that call with specificity when they need to.
So I made a couple of notes as you were talking there, and actually a couple of things that have sort of popped up certainly on EMS One inside the EMS community. Very recently, actually, our good friend Doug Wolfberg wrote an article about performative EMS. In other words, you're going to be on camera, you're going to be viewed, you're going to be seen, as you've already said, as that person that is silent, stoic, not involved, just standing there. And of course, whilst they could well be thinking, contemplating, working out the next course of action, but we don't know that because we can't read a mind. And therefore, I think that's an article that we should all refer to in as a companion piece to this. Also, for those that have been, or for our followers on EMS One-Stop, we recently interviewed New Orleans EMS. They have a comprehensive body-worn camera program. We interviewed them tail end of last year, where they were talking about all of the things you've just covered. The fact is that it's not just the clinical piece, it's actually the staff protection piece. And sometimes, they may get assaulted. There may be accusations they did something when they didn't. They've absolutely bought into the program. Good news, bad news, and I don't know which way you read this, but of course they had all of their body-worn cameras on January the 1st. And so that also became part of the evidential capture of what they were doing on that day. And so if you want a open and shut case, talking to lawyers, open and shut case, go and look back at what we've done with New Orleans on both those interviews. One, the reasons they have the cameras, and then a snippet of our discussion on from the January the 1st event about how those cameras came into play. And so I make those points here and I'll put the links in the show notes because I think it's exactly relevant. And, it's a bit after the fact from the McClain case, but some organizations are now following through with this, which I think is excellent. Now, you mentioned about, the relationships with the police. And again, there have now subsequently been joint statements about cooperation and everything else, which is good. We often use the probably hackneyed phrase, you shouldn't be exchanging your business card at the scene of the crime, the scene of the accident, but there were communications breakdowns. So take us back to that day. And then, of course, your extrapolation and lessons from that.
So I would say, first, just kind of responding quickly to some comments you just made, Rob. Optics are huge in this day and age. So many people form opinions based on optics, and there are cameras everywhere. There are ring cams, there are business cameras, police wear body cams, there are satellite cameras. And so you're going to be on camera, but we do believe that paramedics should have their own body cameras because they do their own thing. And part of the problem in our case, part of the kind of overwhelming thing that went against our clients is the jurors know the outcome before they start watching cameras of what happened. They know a young man died who shouldn't have died, who should still be with us. They know a tragedy happens. And then it makes it easy to go, why isn't that paramedic doing something? He's just standing there. And again, it's documenting, it's accounting for what you did. And that's part of the communication problem. Some police officers made statements to the EMTs. There were 2 EMTs and 2 paramedics. The EMTs did not have the same powers and authority to act that the paramedics do. The officers don't really know. What gets told to one person, as Shana alluded to already, didn't get relayed, sometimes accurately, sometimes at all, to other people. At one point, Jeremy Cooper goes over, is trying to interact with the patient. Police are still holding him down. Police are still giving commands like, stop moving. We've told you, stop fighting, which leads firemedic Cooper to believe this is still a person who's very aggravated, very worked up, is still fighting with police. And he goes over and he's trying to communicate with who he thinks is his patient at this point. And he asked the officer, do we know if he speaks English? They're in a part of Aurora, Colorado, a specific apartment building where there are lots of people who are from different places. Some people speak English, some people don't. In response to Fire Medic Cooper asking the question, Mr. McClain starts basically writhing. It looks like he's trying to get up from the officer, and the officer picks him up and slams him to the ground, which if you're a trained fire medic is the last thing you want. You want to calm this scene down. You do not want your patient more agitated. You do not want your patient to get hurt in a scuffle with police. And so Fireman Cooper stands up kind of like this, is like, okay, I'll wait. And what he says later is, I tried to bring calm to the situation. I didn't try to amp it up more by having further contact with Mr. McClain or the officer. I tried to calm everybody down. But the downside of that is then it makes it look like he's not doing anything. He really had a reason for what he did. And again, documentation, if he could have put that down, or if he had a body cam and he could say, well, what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to wait a few minutes and let everything calm down, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, and one of the things Mike was starting to touch on was, as the team approached, they kind of split apart. Lieutenant Chikuniak went out, didn't come up to the patient because he was trying to figure out, how do I get this ambulance in? The ambulance is en route. How do I get it in? He had safety. That was his job. He's out on the street. The two MTs came up, and the sergeant for the police did a handoff report to one EMT. That EMT, then the other EMT turns to the officers that are physically restraining Elijah. He gets additional information. Those two EMTs informed each other. They didn't tell the paramedics. They never said anything to the paramedics. Meanwhile, Jeremy's working his way around to get to the head of his patient. And as he's trying to talk to the one officer who's physically one of the three that's physically on top of Mr. McClain, the sergeant starts talking, and you can see he turns and he's looking at the sergeant and he's trying to get information. Then Mr. McClain is, whatever is going on that appears to be, based on what the officers are yelling, is him continuing to fight. Jeremy turns back, and so he cannot hear what that sergeant is continuing to say. But the one EMT can, because he turns and he's continuing to look at the sergeant the entire time. So there's all this information being shared and said that's not getting communicated to the paramedic who is in charge of that patient's care. Furthermore, there is conversations that part are caught on camera, part are not. And so again, with the documentation piece, it looks really suspicious if 4 years after the fact, you were to say, oh, I remember what's being said right there, where it's not, you can tell fire's talking, but you don't know what's being said. And it's not documented because they're worried about their patient. So I don't believe, I fully and firmly believe everything we've heard from Pete and Jeremy this entire time and their crew. And, you know, their team did converse about some things, but we don't know what it was because it's not recorded in a body-worn camera and it's not documented. And we do know that what each of them knew at that time versus learned later, as you break down what the heck happened on that call versus years of litigation later, that's near impossible to go back and recreate at this point.
It's a great point. And talking of points, we're going to just stop for a second and have a quick message from our sponsor.
Lexipol empowers first responders and public servants to best meet the needs of their residents safely and responsibly. Serving more than 2 million public safety and government professionals in over 8,000 agencies and municipalities, Lexipol offers a range of solutions that includes policies, training, behavioral health resources, news and analysis, and grant assistance services for law enforcement, fire and rescue, EMS, local government, and other agencies dedicated to public safety. To learn more, visit lexipol.com. That's LEXIPOL.com.
And we're back. I say this every time. Please make sure that you like and subscribe on the channel that you either take your podcast from, or indeed, if you're watching us on YouTube, on the EMS One YouTube channel, of course, please hit the like and subscribe there. As I also keep saying every week, we are on audio on the podcast channel. We're also on video on YouTube. So if you're listening, you can watch, and if you're watching, you can listen. We are deliver the communication in every which way that we can over here at EMS One and the EMS One-Stop. Talking about the Elijah McClain case, talking with Shana Beggan and Mike Pellow. Thank you for an amazingly informative first half. I'm going to keep the questions going because, again, we're picking out a lot of lessons identified and a lot of things we need to take away. And also allied to some of the discussions that certainly I've had with folk like Wolfberg, with the folk in New Orleans about their cameras, etc., with the folk at the National Association of EMS Physicians on their statements. So there's a lot of stuff coming together now after the fact. But of course, you've been within this from the beginning, so we need to hear from you. Training and protocols. I mean, clearly, I know that there has been legislation in Colorado after this. So, you know, there's training, there's protocols. I'm going to add politics as well. So, I mean, that's a general heading, but off you go.
There have been a number of changes made, not just in Aurora, Colorado, not just in Colorado statewide, but nationwide in the face of this tragedy. And there should have been. And one of the major things does involve training. We, of course, have the benefit of hindsight, and that's 2020. One of the things we definitely advocate for is joint trainings. You can tell police and fire, start working together towards a better transition, a better handoff of care. But the way you accomplish that, you play like you practice it, train together. And we spoke on this at the symposium in Pennsylvania. There were police officers present, there were paramedics present, and everybody says this is exactly what we need. And we feel strongly the same way. Do trainings together at times. Do hypotheticals. If this happens, how are we going to respond? That's the best way to react. Here, as we told you about, there is a weight-based medication, ketamine, that was given. One of the changes in Colorado is ketamine can't be administered in this situation any longer. But it's important, if you have something like a weight-based medication, practice that. Don't just, and the training here was not very good. It was not put on by the medical director himself. Other people put it on, and they used kind of examples, categories. Well, you can give 300 or 400 or 500 milligrams of ketamine, kind of trying to size people into categories. That's not the most effective way to do things. And when it's dark and a number of officers are on top of an individual, it makes it almost impossible. You're just guessing. You're basically just guessing at somebody's weight. Well, play like you practice that. Get a person, put them in a coat, put them in something, do it in the dark, take turns. And this is something, training can be helped by body cameras as well. It's important to review calls and kind of what are the highs, what are the lows of this particular call? What did we do well? What could we have done better? Especially when you don't have a bad outcome. It's just a run-of-the-mill case. No case is run-of-the-mill to the patient or to the paramedics themselves, but take a case where nothing bad happened and review it. Look at your body cams. Look at what did you do? What could you do better? All of this, we believe, is very important, essential to ongoing patient care and for paramedics to do better in their profession and to protect themselves.
I think that perhaps this is the lawyers in us. Part of our job is to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But another part of our job is performative in the sense of if you're a trial litigator. So in an ideal world, I would love to see role-playing scenarios. Many firehouses are near police departments, are near their ambulance, where the ambulance is discharged from. Not always. Sometimes the ambulance leaves from the hospital, but and nobody has enough time. We don't, and everything's shifted to virtual. But in these scenarios, you can, even if you came up with a simulated hot box, a simulated agitated parent, you got police. We needed a handoff. The police are like, we called for a medical assist. It's your patient. But fire's like, are you kidding me? We came in and we were completely shut down. Not only did you physically manhandle our patient, we got overridden. When we said, here's what we're going to do, we were told, no, we're going to do this. And so until those handcuffs were off, it was very obvious that this was a patient in law enforcement's custody. And we can change a protocol and say, oh, there needs to be a clear handoff. Well, what does that mean? Administrators can write these policies, but boots on the ground have to know how to implement it. And that's not fair to just write a policy and then expect the people actually putting it into place to be able to do it. Furthermore, if you're going to do a training and the person doing the training is ad-libbing things that are not on the slides, like, oh, 300, 400, 500 is fine. That's just fine. And everybody that we talked to that attended the trainings and the trainer himself said, yeah, I did that. And that's what stuck, because that makes sense. You're in a high stress situation. What do I remember? 300, that's children. 400, that's a small woman. 500 is everybody else, and it's okay. And we're not going to say, hey, stand up here. Everybody in the room, write down what you think this person weighs. Okay, let's turn the lights off. Let's take another person. Let's put 5 people on them, because a lot of fire and paramedics respond in the dark, on the ground, with people restraining them, with coats on, with coats off. Now guess. Okay, now I see this person with their clothes cut off in the back of an ambulance. Shit, they look different. What do I do? Oh my gosh, that no longer looks like 200. How do I handle that? None of this was discussed. None of this was planned for. And that's medicine. That's how medicine gets better. And that's how, with body-worn cameras, if we can get there, that's how trainings get better, because we can talk about it, but it needs to be done in a safe way that protects our responders. They're human. They're trying their best. If they're not, well, that'll probably get revealed as well and can be dealt with. But I firmly believe, and I am 100% positive in our situation, they were all trying to do their best, and they did not mean anybody to get hurt. And we need to be able to talk about that and train on it and go, how do we fix this forward looking? So we have to do it. Don't just change the protocol. Yeah, that needs to be done. Don't just change the policy. That's up here. Train on it and then come back and help people and create an avenue to ask questions, to say, how can this go better? What would we do differently? What went well? And engage in that forum and that conversation, not in a blame the finger, point the finger. I would never have done that. Easy to say. You're not in that situation. Let's have a dialogue and make it safe to do it. That's how we show up and provide the gold standard care we all strive for. And that's how we protect our patients and our first responders.
So some interesting points there. I'm all one for simulation, and again, it's almost what somebody would call a Robism, right? Very rarely do we do an intubation on a classroom table with the lights on. It's and so to achieve that training value, it's a case of getting into the store cupboard with a flashlight over your head, working the patient that way. That's the realistic thing. I used to have a session where I talked about this, and it was simply called, my session title was "In the Alleyway by the Dumpster," because that's where most EMS medicine takes place, right? And so you have to think about the environment that we're going to end up in, not the environment, the training environment that we start in. And I think you made those points elegantly. So let me talk to the lawyers for a second. A number of legal standards here. When I first arrived in the United States, we had sort of, Crown immunities in Virginia. Of course, that got swept by the side. We then had, the paramedic is liable for, for some sort of civil litigation. We've now gone fully into criminal issues here. So, can you sort of, define the history of that, and obviously then bring it up to where the case is with McClain, and how do we go from very rarely unless it was a deliberate murder, and I'm using, for those listening, I'm using air quotes here.
Right.
How have we got to where we are?
So one of our strongest held beliefs, I'm speaking for Shana here, but I think accurately, and I'm definitely speaking for myself, one of the worst things going on in this country and worldwide that this case illustrates is the criminalization of medical practice and the politicization of our justice system. Equally bad things, in my opinion. And when Shana was talking about a safe place, training in a safe place, going over body cams, not the finger pointing. And unfortunately, it's become the immediate impulse is something goes bad, something goes wrong. Who do we blame? Blame somebody. That's not how you fix things. You make things worse when you make people who practice medicine feel like they have to hide what they did. You want them to be honest and open and upfront about what happened and learn from it and benefit from it. You take somebody at basically the bottom of an entire healthcare system, and that's a paramedic on the scene. There's medical directors over him. There's a hospital over the medical director. There's a whole complicated, intricate healthcare system in this country. And to pick the person who is closest to the damage, the low-hanging fruit, as it were, and say, let's blame this person, let's criminalize this, is the wrong thing to do. We don't learn lessons from that. We don't make our system better that way. We don't provide better care. And this gets into the legal standards. There are civil remedies when something goes wrong in medical care. There are administrative remedies. People can lose their license to practice professionally. Much better ways of dealing with making a system better, the entire system better, than criminalizing one person who is just part of an entire chain of events and going, you are to blame, you're a criminal. That is such a wrong approach. And this case, to me and to Shana, just illustrates that.
And I think, how did we get here? We got here, well, in this case specifically, we got here very much through politics. The situation initially was investigated in Colorado. The district attorney's office does the investigations when it's not like something statewide in terms of like a multiple racketeering gang situation type of thing. And the district attorney's office declined charges and said, no, there's nothing, this is not criminal. It didn't mean they said this was great, this was perfect. Everybody believed this was tragic and needed to be dealt with. There was separate licensing issues being looked at. There was a civil case going on. The civil attorneys, along with the timing of COVID and then George Floyd, percolated to a lot of pressure being brought to bear on the governor. The governor then turned to the attorney general to say, hey, look at this and tell me if something needs to happen. And the AG's office ran with it in a very, in my opinion, politically based investigation. What I mean by that is not one of Elijah's treating doctors, treatment team, wherever even put before the grand jury or put in, it just, and I get it. You have an innocent young man who died and shouldn't have. But to take that and make it criminal, and in Colorado, and this is a huge battle we had in the trial, and it's a huge battle on appeal, and to then subject these paramedics in the criminal case to an even lower standard than they are subjected to in the civil case or in the licensing is despicable. This was a huge battle, but ultimately the judge decided that all the jury would be told is they could assess this on a reasonable person, not a reasonable paramedic, not a paramedic in Aurora, a reasonable person standard. The jurors so struggled with this. They asked very few questions, but the questions they asked were, can we have some help with standard of care and gross deviation? Because that was the critical underpinning to, was this criminally negligent homicide? They were very quick to say not guilty on all the other charges, but can we have help on this? We again battled. Judge, the answer is yes. Tell them this is what gross deviation means, and tell them standard of care is what would a paramedic in Aurora, Colorado at this time have done? And the judge determined, no, in the criminal law, this isn't really defined. In the civil law, I agree that that's the standard. But I don't, even though the law allows me to bring that to the criminal side, I just don't think that's right. We think that's wrong. That's a huge battle. But it is shocking to know that as a paramedic, you're always taught, you're practicing under a doctor's license. You have this medical standard of care, didn't apply in the criminal world. And that has to be fixed. That cannot be accurate. You cannot let our first responders be out there getting less protection in a criminal analysis than they do in the other settings.
And one way to illustrate what effect this had is we have data that showed in over half of the cases where ketamine was administered by Aurora paramedics, 500 milligrams was given, regardless of the patient's weight. In other words, it was trained improperly and inappropriately. Paramedics were being told it's safe, you can give the maximum dosage and you'll be okay. And that's exactly what they were doing. And nobody was charged criminally. Nobody was even investigated until we had a tragic outcome. And deciding to charge somebody criminally because you have a tragic outcome is the wrong way to do it. It's acting with hindsight. It's not acting with foresight. It's just coming along going, who can we blame? Which, as I said, and I would just say it again to illustrate the point, is the wrong way to fix our medical care in this country.
The wrong way to fix our medical care in this country. That's going to be one of my sound bites for this episode. We've spoken a lot about body-worn cameras, and I've mentioned the interviews that I've done. Obviously, there's also some guidance now from, with the assistance of PWW law, Wolfberg and Worth, Nemesis have issued the sort of the legal safeguards, if you like, we'll call it that, around the use of body-worn cameras. But obviously, no prizes for anybody here. You are absolute advocates now of body-worn cameras for EMS personnel.
Absolutely. And let me be clear, though. I'm talking to your town council, your town managers, your governors, your whoever's controlling the purse strings. When I'm advocating for this, I'm not advocating you take further out of the first responders budget. They're already underfunded. So they need to create a budget that allows for body-worn cameras and the IT infrastructure. Many, if not all states have done this for law enforcement. I see no reason why joint IT teams couldn't work collaboratively in the same cities and towns. They already know how to download, how to store, how to handle discovery requests. You would need people trained on HIPAA and trained on the nuances for fire or for paramedics, but do not take that out of these fire departments and these EMS departments' budgets. That cannot be the answer. If I was the medical director, or if I was overseeing these, that's my big fear. Holy cow, you're going to now tell me I have to implement this and we're responsible for it, but you're not going to give me more money, more people, more time. So this program, if you had the cameras, would protect the patients, would protect our providers, would allow for always the ability to see. Medical directors can't be out on every call. That's ridiculous. Commanders can't be out on every call, but they can review and go, this is working well. This isn't working so well. Let's fix it. It is safer for everybody, and it underpins the just culture that medicine has sought to implement for over a decade that is now being dismantled. It allows for people to know what's going on. You still deal with the fact that cameras are two-dimensional. You still deal with the fact that there's human error and technology errors. But aside from those that we can deal with, it would be just so much fair for everybody. If we're going to be in a world that people are going to judge us based on what they see, then let us at least have cameras trying to get it from our perspective as much as we can.
So thank you for that. And also our sponsor of this show, Lexapol, has, and through Police One and through EMS One, has the Body Worn Camera How to Buy Guide. And it talks about all the considerations, funding, storage issues, and all the things that you need to be aware of. And as Shana just kind of mentioned there are, if you work for a city, there's going to be some IT manager. They're going to talk about funding. They're going to talk about storage, obviously redaction, then the HIPAA aspects of that. And so again, another episode where the show notes are chock full of references for you to read into. My standard question at the end, councils, is there anything I've forgotten to ask or anything you want to tell us?
I want to be very clear when I say I have so much passion for first responders. To our clients, we represent Jeremy, but Pete was as much of a client. We did a joint defense. When Pete was in custody, I would go visit him at prison. We would go visit him at the prison, and it was so hard. These people give every day. And specifically, Pete and Jeremy together have almost 40 years of being first responders and zero complaints ever about their care. In fact, they have tremendous accolades and awards, and they want to be the ones sitting here. We're the ones telling them they can't, but they want to be part of the fix moving forward. Or ever meant anything to happen to Elijah except to get him help and save his life. That's what they thought they were doing. And it is just so hard to work with the community that you're addressing today, who lay their lives and dedicate their profession to helping others and find them under a microscope in this way. And just know we are here for all of you, and our clients are here, and we want to be part of the fix because we are so proud of the work that's done.
And I would say to that, amen. And absolutely, first responder community do better. And we don't do that by making them look over their shoulders and thinking, where am I going to get whacked in the back of the head if something goes wrong? That, again, I just would reiterate, that's the wrong approach. We need to be better at helping them. And that's what Shana and I are very passionate about right now. We want to see them get more help, not less.
Thank you. And as I've told you privately, you certainly, in my mind, will and are becoming great advocates for us. And so thank you. Also, thank you for coming here to tell the story, come here to represent your clients, and obviously come here to really give us some valuable food for thought and some amazing takeaways. And there's a whole body of issues and items that have now come out from this. And obviously to have you guys on has been really something special for me, just to sort of really top out the entire sort of package of things that we've been thinking about. So thank you. And again, this is not over. Obviously, we've got a lot more, still a road to travel, and we'll stay with you and follow and see what happens next, literally. One final question before we go, and I happen to know the Aurora fire chief, and as you both know, we grew up professionally together in Virginia before we moved across to Colorado. But obviously, it's a function of leadership. The chief's got a lot on his plate, and he's got to deal with this. And he was relatively new, or possibly came in shortly after. But talk about the support from leadership.
Yeah. So Chief Otten is the fire chief now in Aurora, and he has been incredible with his support. And he wrote a letter to the court on behalf of both Pete and Jeremy. And in it, he highlighted what Mike was talking about earlier, which is when it's a systemic failure, when you have a systems fall apart, you don't target the last person at the bottom of that list. And he highlighted some of the problems that specifically were in existence that I think your audience would really appreciate. In 2019, Metropolitan Fire EMS for Aurora responded to more than 50,000 calls. Their medical director was only contracted for 10 hours a month and was grossly underpaid. Not that he undercut what he did because of his pay, but 10 hours a month for over 400 providers who were responding to 50,000 calls. There was no EMS bureau. It had been dismantled the year before. The same year they unleashed this new protocol, they dismantled the EMS bureau. And even within the fire department, the chief at that time was told, don't do this. We need our own EMS bureau. And they did. Again, budget. That didn't reflect the national best practices, but it really broke down the infrastructure. And it's what kind of led to why they had to delegate out their trainings. They didn't have it. They didn't have a clinical educator. So the private ambulance service that came in and did the teaching was not even somebody that was from Aurora Fire, wasn't somebody that was one of their team or even functioned under that same protocol. In 2019, the Chief Otten said, look, the Denver Regional EMS protocols called for the care that aligned with how the medics performed on this call. But that after it, the region identified the deficiencies and then they changed the protocols and they changed them to be better providers. He also talked about that Aurora at the time didn't have BLS, like just a basic unit you could send out. So you sent the heavy rig on every call. Even though 20 to 30,000 of those calls might have just needed basic, that went to Aurora Fire. It didn't get delegated out. So that can show up in ways that look like complacency, that can look like fatigue, that can look like, wow, what's my decision making, and can lead to different outcomes. He pointed to when you have 50,000 calls and everybody is responding, you can have unreasonable and unsustainable goals set and expected for these teams. And he highlighted that we perform the way we train and here the training was poor. And I'm reading directly from his letter. We perform the way we train and here the training was poor. We condone or even promote what we fail to address. Given the protocols and given the lack of training and oversight, the feedback and oversight were all but non-existent. The fact that our members performed so well for so long is admirable. And I'm just sorry that I wasn't here sooner to correct these deficiencies before we had such a devastating outcome. I think that you're dealing with somebody who understands systemic failure and can really feel for how that trickled down and hurt his teams and two of his most highly decorated and most highly respected paramedics more than anybody could have ever envisioned.
I know this to be true. You have a great fire chief and he's a good friend. And so I will, if we can, publish that letter as well, if it's in a public space, because again, it's a function of leadership, as well as everything else that we've talked about today. Mike and Shana, thank you so much for sparing the time to talk to me. I know this is going to get a great reception. This is very topical. We need to be paying attention to everything we've discussed. But and hopefully we'll have you back on in the future as the case comes to a close. But thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Rob, for giving us the opportunity to say what we're passionate about. We appreciate it.
Indeed, they are both very passionate about, we covered a lot of ground there. There's been a lot of takeaways. We're going to have a lot of links in the show notes. So please make sure you read down the page if you're watching or listening. It's all there. So that's been another great edition of EMS One-Stop. More to follow as the year goes on. We've got some great guests coming in. My thanks to Mike and to Shana. This has been EMS One-Stop. Make sure you like and subscribe. I've been Rob Lawrence, and until next time, bye for now.